Thanks for everyone for being here, and those who are watching on Zoom and on video. It's great to be home, not just in my native town, Montreal, but in CIJR, which when I was a student here for many years, it was my home. The CIJR started around the time that shortly before I began my studies at Concordia, and it was a difficult time at Concordia. It only got worse. We could not have imagined, but it was a difficult time then to be a supporter of Israel. They used to, have giant banners saying the Star of David is the swastika and things like that. Again, it got much worse. But there was only one institution that really stood up for us, and that was CIJR, which was newly created by Professor Krantz and supported by many of the people here and who are watching. And it was in a very difficult time. There was one institution that said, Hineni, we are here for you. And that was Professor Krantz and the CIJR. And it created a Jewish think tank doing real research, a pro-Israel think tank, and brought in many students. So I started my activism as a student here. The office was somewhere else, but in this institution. And indeed, I was given the opportunity to write for and eventually edit the student magazine here, Dateline Middle East, which was a tremendous experience. And I went on, writing became my life's work. So it really began here. I remember I used to submit articles to the Concordia student newspaper. I don't know if it's still the link, if it still exists. And I used to sincerely send them articles, and they would say, thank you very much. I would hand it to them. I said, thank you very much. I'd put it on a pile. And it was just going in the garbage. And they wouldn't publish our submissions. So then we had Dateline Middle East, where we could actually speak and write. So I'm tremendously grateful to CIJR, and indeed to Professor Krantz, who was my mentor and my teacher. I also studied with him at Liberal Arts College. So really, every moment that I spent with Professor Krantz was always a thrill, because you were in the presence of someone who had so many great books in his mind, and books from Western civilization, but also from Jewish civilization, and such a broad and a deep view. And just sitting with him and talking with him was really always an exciting moment. You've had this thrill of spanning different nations and centuries, and his commitment to the truth and to the Jewish people is exemplary, and so many of us are beneficiaries of his pioneering work and his dedication. So it's really great to be here. And just looking at the books here, so many wonderful books, just remind me what an intellectual bastion this place is. And I just want to say again, thank you to Machla for the very kind introduction. Indeed, I knew her since I was a little kid. That began when she was running the library in my school, and also her husband, who sadly passed away last year, was a dedicated teacher of mine for many years of Hebrew, Torah, and was an inspiring teacher, got us all excited. We knew him from when he was young. He was always 29. He was always 29. We said, Rabbi, what's your birthday? Say, I'm 29. So he was, maybe when he was 29, and even when he wasn't 29. But he also took us on exciting field trips to New York for the first time, the Sea of Mishnayos, which were very hard to organize. And so we have tremendous memories. We miss him very much.
Thank you.
And to see other good friends of mine, the Bowers, who are stalwart members of CIJR and old friends of mine. So great to see all of you here. And also, last but not least, to see the photo on the wall in the back of Baruch Cohen, who was such an important figure here, who lived, thank God, lived a long life and was an inspiring figure for many of us here. So with that having been said, I want to share with you today a few words about, we're now a little over a year past October 7th, this horrible date, a date that shall live in infamy. And I'll share with you from the front lines of the UN what our battles have been and where I see things going. So, the little over less than a year ago, we marked the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in a special session of the General Assembly held in the Palais de Chaillot. Maybe there's some people here who know the Palais de Chaillot in Paris. It's not far from the Eiffel Tower. You can see it. It was a special session held there of the General Assembly, and on December 10th, 1948, so in a few days we'll mark that anniversary, they adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt was the leading force behind it. René Cassin is credited for being the architect of the draft, but of course Canadians will invoke, and I saw there's a book behind the pillar there by John Humphrey, who was a law professor at McGill University, and I remember him in my years at McGill Law School. He was in his last years of his life. He was a law professor who was recruited to write the initial draft. He wrote the initial draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He was a Canadian law professor, grew up in the Maritimes, and he wrote the initial draft. And in that Universal Declaration adopted in 1948, the preamble gives the background of why it was adopted. And of course, this is the aftermath of the Nazi atrocities of the Holocaust. And it says, we are adopting this declaration in response to barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. Barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. And indeed, the purpose of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was to be the global response to such barbarous acts. And indeed, on October 7th, we saw barbarous acts. And these were recognized immediately by world leaders. President Biden said that there are times in this world when pure, unadulterated evil is unleashed upon this world. And the then Prime Minister of Britain, Rishi Sunak, said at the time that this was a pogrom that we saw. And so world leaders understood that these were horrific, barbarous acts, one of the worst terrorist attacks ever in modern times. 1,200 people massacred and tortured and humiliated in the worst possible ways. So we look to the United Nations to be a response to barbarous acts, as the Universal Declaration promised. And yet, if we look at the actions of the United Nations, we see sadly that in most, if not all cases, if we look at the leading UN officials, the leading UN bodies have failed to respond, to call out these barbarous acts, to defend the principles of human rights as they were envisioned a little over 75 years ago. And we see in many cases on the contrary. We'll start with the leader of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who just a few weeks after the massacre infamously said, on the one hand, he said, I condemn the terrorist acts of Hamas. I condemn these acts, yes. But, he said, we must recognize that these acts by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. Did not happen in a vacuum. And then he went on to enumerate one after another alleged Palestinian grievances, effectively justifying the attack. Palestinians suffered then, and they suffered then. He said it didn't happen in a vacuum. And a few days in Israel and elsewhere, there was outrage, and he said, no, I did never justified. I said I condemn, but he said, well, he did justify. And the truth is that what he said, when he said the words, these acts did not happen in a vacuum, that sentence alone is not wrong. It's not like actually, it's true. Because nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing that we did today or yesterday or ever in our lives happened in a vacuum. It all comes from surrounding circumstances and so forth. But if he had an ounce of self-reflection, Mr. Guterres might have asked the atrocities of Hamas to not happen in a vacuum. Well, where do they grow up? These students, these terrorists. Where do they go to school? And according to the former head of the legal department of UNRWA in Gaza, Mr. Johan Soufi, I was debating him on France Info in, I believe it was March in Paris, and he said 90% of students in Gaza go to UNRWA schools, UN schools. So Mr. Guterres, if he had an ounce of self-reflection, would say it didn't happen in a vacuum. Where did they go to school? Right? You all remember when the Israeli prime minister was assassinated, everyone said, where did the assassin go to school? He went to Bar Ilan. They're responsible in this. And there was this whole huge debate. But it's a legitimate question. When 90% of the terrorists went to UNRWA schools, and this is an agency that we're all paying for. The Canadian government gives tens of millions of dollars a year, not just the money, the endorsement. Just a few days ago, there was a minister, I'm forgetting his name, but was on Twitter, pictures of him with some UNRWA people endorsing UNRWA. And sadly, our UN ambassador in New York, Bob Ray, has praised UNRWA. And you go governments around the world, Western governments, embrace this agency. And I'll come to it a bit later in my remarks. But so that was Guterres. effectively justifying Hamas right at the beginning, just a few weeks after the massacre. And that message, sadly, permeated and pervaded the UN, so that many UN agencies began to follow that line, not necessarily because of what he said, but that was the line that was shared throughout the UN system. We can just briefly look at a few of them. I mean, UN Women, as you know, for several months, UN Women didn't even address what happened. There was sexual assault, and UN Women, if any agency is supposed to address sexual assault during a terrorist attack and an invasion, should have been UN Women. And it's not that they didn't address Gaza. They did. They had many things saying what the women in Gaza are suffering. And the issues that they raised, if they were true or not, I'm sure women were suffering, but it wasn't primarily a women's issue. Everyone was suffering in Gaza. They launched a war. Hamas is hiding underneath the civilians. Of course, civilians were made to suffer by Hamas's actions. But they weren't primarily women's issues, but the sexual assault of women in Israel by Hamas, this was a women's issue, and for months they didn't say a thing. Only when there was real major outrage and some Israeli women's activists went to New York and various activists in America and elsewhere did they finally say something, and even then they had a sort of a two sides, sort of all sides statements. And I'll just mention one example. At UN Women, one of their top officials, a woman named Sarah Douglas, I think she was vice president for security or something, someone sent me a photo of her speaking at the United Nations. She was speaking from home, so it was kind of like a Zoom, and she was addressing a United Nations meeting. So she was on a giant screen at the United Nations in New York, and she's at home. She's talking about UN Women issues, and behind her, in her home, is a giant poster with a Palestinian flag. Now, I don't know about you, but when I do a Zoom in a professional setting, you know what's behind you. You know, if you have your dirty laundry there or your dirty dishes, you move it away and you try to make as nice a background as you can. And you know darn well, if you're speaking to the United Nations, that you have a poster with a Palestinian flag behind you. It's impossible that she wasn't aware and didn't do that deliberately. So someone sent me that picture, and I was about to tweet it out, that the UN officials, including UN Women, take an oath to be neutral, and she's speaking behind a Palestinian flag. And before I did it, I said, but who is this person? And I began to look on Twitter. Up until half a year ago, or maybe half a year ago, you could see on Twitter, unlike some other platforms, you could go to a person's account, and not only do you see their tweets, their posts, but you see what they liked. Many people didn't know that. They would click like. Well, I see something I like, click like, and not aware that someone can go on the feed of your likes and see everything you liked. And I went and I could see the feed, not of her posts. Her post, she was a bit more careful. She had some things against Israel, but I could see her likes. And there were about 150, and it's basically a public act, because there was a public feed of the likes. And there were about, in a period of a couple of months, from October 7th until, I think I looked at her feed in December. So for about 2 months, there were about, I think, 170 posts that she shared or that she liked that were celebrating mass protests taking over bridges and streets by radical groups in America, celebrating the Squad, the radical left politicians in America, like Rashida Tlaib and AOC and the others, against Israel. And there's things that are actually in the political realm. Again, UN officers take an oath of neutrality, so she's embracing radical politicians, celebrating anti-Israel actions and protests and campaigns, and day after day, all the time. So that was just an example of UN Women. When we raised it, the UN said, "Oh yeah, it's under investigation." But they did acknowledge, exceptionally, that it was a violation of the Code of Conduct, and said it's under investigation. Fast forward, we're now a year later, and nothing's happened to her. So that's UN Women. I'll mention a couple of others, and then I'm going to focus on the UNHRC and UNRWA. Another one is the WHO. I live in Geneva, and near me is the World Health Organization. You know famously that during the COVID corona crisis, they were kowtowing repeatedly to the Chinese Communist Party. Whatever the line was of the Chinese Communist Party, that's what the WHO echoed, despite their obligations to the world on a global health crisis. If China didn't want to talk about it or declare it a crisis, or say it happened in Wuhan or this or that, certainly in the initial period, and thereafter, they were very much under the influence of China, and China played a key role in getting a number of the current and the former director general, getting them elected, China played a key role. So the World Health Organization, the head, Dr. Tedros, he has repeatedly condemned Israel for violating the sanctity of hospitals and medical clinics, saying that Israel is violating the Geneva Conventions, when the complete opposite is true. When what's happening in Gaza and the hospitals is that terrorists have repeatedly used hospitals, like the Al-Shifa Hospital and others, as their headquarters. The Hamas terrorists have no shame when it comes to cynicism. They take whatever is a bastion of humanitarianism, like a hospital, and they know that Israel does not bomb hospitals, so they would put their headquarters there. That we saw video of hostages being brought into the hospitals. And eventually Israel went in surgical ways, actually went in and in Arabic told people to move out and told them in advance to move the patients out, and went to look for the terrorists. And when Israel would go to root out the terrorists who are materially violating the Geneva Conventions, which provide that militants, combatants are not allowed to use hospitals to operate from, Israel is enforcing the Geneva Conventions by rooting out the terrorists, and yet Dr. Tedros repeatedly, time after time after time, condemns Israel for its actions, which are actually to enforce the Geneva Conventions. So that's the UN Women, that's the World Health Organization, and we could give many examples. I could talk about an exhibit that's going on right now in UN headquarters in New York that has pictures. It's a photo exhibit in New York City, giant exhibit. It's got photos of so-called journalists who celebrated the terrorist attack, celebrated when the terrorists said, "We've taken abaya, sexual slaves." They were laughing about it, and photographs of some of these people are being featured in UN headquarters. Really despicable. But the final example I want to make, or the final two examples, are the UNHRC and UNRWA. So I'll say a word about the Human Rights Council. I already mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She was the founding chair of the UN Human Rights Council. It was initially called the Commission on Human Rights. This is 1946. Right after the UN was established, Eleanor Roosevelt was the founding chair of the Commission on Human Rights. In 2 years, they adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Her vice chair was René Cassin, a French legal philosopher. But sadly, over time, this body became hijacked by dictatorships, became a body not of eminent individuals, but of governments, and not governments that care about human rights, but governments whose only expertise on human rights is on how to systematically violate human rights. So the current membership of the Human Rights Council, which here in Canada, Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, and the Lord spoke to Moses at Sinai. It's the UN Human Rights Council. When you say those words in a country like Canada or in Europe where I live, the UN Human Rights Council, you imagine men with long white beards, dressed in white robes, strolling along Mount Olympus, making their decisions based on facts, logic, and morality, when nothing could be further from the truth, when those sitting around the table are not Socrates, Aristotle, or Plato, but rather historically Gaddafi, his regime was the chair of the Human Rights Commission in 2003. Castro, the communist regime of Cuba has always been on the Human Rights Council. The House of Saud, the Islamic regime of Iran, which last year was made chair of the UN Human Rights Council Social Forum, not making this up, last year. These are the members of the Human Rights Council, and currently, as we speak, 60% of the members are either full-on dictatorships or other forms of non-democracy. The current members include the Chinese Communist Party, which is oppressing 1.5 billion people. 1/5 of humanity are being oppressed by the Chinese Communist Party. No freedom of religion, freedom of association. Our organization, Human Watch, we help organize with 25 other NGOs a annual human rights conference called the Geneva Summit for Human Rights. We've been doing this for over 15 years. We bring victims of the world's worst dictatorships who are typically ignored, neglected, abandoned by the UN, their oppressors are typically elevated and elected to the highest human rights bodies. Victims from China, Cuba, Venezuela, Syria, Iran, Belarus, and other regimes. We bring them to testify. Last year in Geneva, it was this year, it was in May, we brought Rei Cha. Rei Cha is a young woman in Shanghai who went on, I think it's called Shanghai Road, and she did this. She held up a blank sheet of paper. for that, she was taken away right away, and thrown into prison. Standing up in Shanghai with a blank piece of paper. That's it. Everyone understood that that's a protest. It's a protest against the system. And without saying anything, that is a crime. And they took her away and threw her into prison. Thankfully, she got out. We hosted her in Geneva. So these are the regimes that are sitting on the UN Human Rights Council, judging, acting as judges, prosecutors, and so forth. So that's the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. Not surprisingly, most of the world's worst abusers get a free pass. Not all. There's a handful that are weak, like North Korea, gets an annual resolution. There's a handful of countries that get condemned, but most of the world's worst regimes, China has never been condemned once, never been criticized. Egypt, which has thousands of political prisoners, never been condemned once. Cuba has teenage political prisoners who stood up 3 years ago, who in the famous, I think it was July 2021, for a rallied for democracy, thrown into prison, never been condemned once. Saudi Arabia, which is getting better when it comes to women's rights, but it's still one of the worst places for women in the world, relatively, never been condemned once. Pakistan, a horrific place when it comes to freedom of religion or basically any other form of human rights, place full of terrorists, sponsors of the Taliban. Pakistan, never been condemned once. A large country. This is, between 100 and 200 million people. Never been condemned once. Zimbabwe, we bring victims from Zimbabwe, dissidents, never been condemned. You can go along the list. Some of the world's worst regimes have never been condemned. And yet, instead, we're going to have a session coming up in March. We meet 3 times a year in September, March, and June. At every single meeting of the UN Human Rights Council, there is one day for the world, called Agenda Item 4, Human Rights Situations Around the World. If you want to give a speech for 3 minutes about Iran, North Korea, Syria, you can do it under Agenda Item 4, Human Rights Around the World. And then a few days later, Agenda Item 7, Human Rights Violations in the Occupied Arab Territories, including Palestine, namely Israel. So one agenda item one day for the world, and one agenda item one day against Israel. No other country in the world, not the communist regime of China, not Vladimir Putin's Russia, which is every day bombing innocent people in Ukraine, not North Korea, one of the most horrific places on the planet. No country in the world is addressed in its own agenda item. If at all they're addressed, it's in the generic item. Only the state of Israel, the Jewish state, a country of 10 million people, a tiny spot, barely visible on the globe, has its own day. So basically, we see, and then of course, when it is that agenda item, they pass numerous resolutions against Israel. There have been more condemnatory resolutions adopted against Israel than on Syria, Iran, and North Korea combined. So it's a farce, and sadly, very few people speak out against it. Obviously, UN Watch does. For more details on all of this, I invite you to visit our database. unwatch.org/database has every resolution that's been adopted in the past several years, and you can see all the details, whether the resolution condemns a country. The UN are great at lying. Okay, I was looking for a nicer word, dissembling. In other words, we'll call it lying. They'll say, no, what do you mean? We adopt 100 resolutions on countries. Yeah, they'll pick resolutions that are either meaningless resolutions, like their resolutions, something called UPR, where every country is reviewed, and they'll review Russia, and half the countries taking the floor during the debate are praising Russia, and it's sort of it's a perfunctory process where many of the statements are praised, and they'll say, well, we adopted a resolution recognizing that the review took place. Not a condemnation. They said, we adopted a resolution on Sri Lanka. Yeah, the resolution praised Sri Lanka after they killed 40,000 Tamils in April 2009. So they'll claim credit for resolutions that actually have no teeth, and in many cases praised the abuser. So our database actually tells you what the thing is. So was it a condemnation, or actually praise, or neutral? So we count condemnations, and we have a lot of details. So if you're a geek, and we have some academic experts, geek in the best sense of the word, people who really want to dig down, then please visit unwatch.org/database, and you can see all the details about the UN resolutions and the details, the bias that I've described. So at the UN Human Rights Council, we talked about the agenda and the resolutions. I'll mention 2 other aspects, is the Commission of Inquiry and one of the experts. So the Commission of Inquiry, Mahla mentioned the ICC just a couple of weeks ago, the International Criminal Court in The Hague. announced arrest warrants against the Prime Minister and Defense Minister of Israel, which is a despicable act. The State of Israel is defending itself from a genocidal terrorist group that broke a ceasefire that was in place for 2 years and invaded Israel and massacred 1,200 people. And for defending itself against a genocidal terrorist army, Israeli leaders have had arrest warrants issued against them. And this process is very much a product of what's been happening at the Human Rights Council. You all will be familiar with the Goldstone report, some of the young people maybe a bit less so, but in 2009, the UN, there was a war between Hamas and Israel called Operation Cast Lead, December 08, January 09. The UN Human Rights Council called an emergency session in Geneva. I was there. I believe it was January 12th, approximately 2009. And they condemned Israel for systematic gross abuses, and they created an inquiry. So first you declare guilty, and then we investigate. First the verdict, and then we'll investigate. So they declared the verdict Israel's guilty, and then they created a commission of inquiry. For 3 months, no one would take the commission of inquiry. No one would accept it because they knew how biased it was. Finally, Judge Goldstone agreed to take it. He said, no, but I'm going to make it balanced. And he was naive. I think he may have had good intentions, but he was naive. He didn't understand that when you take on an inquiry, he doesn't do the detailed work. It's a staff. You have a staff of 25 people doing the stuff. And the staff, I know them because they sit next to me in Geneva, were some of the most biased people in the world. And I'll tell you about them in a moment. So Judge Goldstone, when the inquiry came out, first of all, he was one of 4 members of the inquiry. The other 3 were horribly anti-Israel. And when the Goldstone report came out on September 15th, 2009, they said that Israeli leaders, political and military, were deliberately seeking to murder innocent civilians. It was a complete lie. Thankfully, Goldstone himself, about a year later, retracted that accusation in a famous op-ed in the Washington Post, but the damage was done. So I certainly commend him for retracting, but the damage was done. Erdogan of Turkey, after the Goldstone report, he spoke and he said, Goldstone is a Jew, which is true. Goldstone is a Jew and his report is clear. Israeli leaders are guilty of war crimes and must go before the ICC. So the ICC that we're talking about today has been at least 15 years in the making. The people at the Human Rights Council have been figuring out ways how to criminalize Israelis, to dehumanize and criminalize Israelis in the eyes of the world. So even as forward-looking countries who actually care about their people, like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, are engaged in normalization to make peace with Israelis and build an incredible future, because what the Emirates and Israel could do together, what the Arab world and Israel could do together with their immense resources of oil and wealth and Israel's innovation and science, what they could do together is incredible if they look towards the future. Normalization. But the Human Rights Council and their supporters want to criminalize Israelis. They're not interested actually in making the Middle East a productive future for everyone, but to criminalize the Jewish state and by extension, make no mistake, the Jewish people. So the Goldstone report, I'll just mention a word or two, is that, as I said, I don't think Goldstone realized one of the authors of the report, the staff people, because it's a 500-page report, so a lot of details in there, and it's the staff who write it. You know, if you ever work for a judge, you'll know, and judges, they may not necessarily write the opinion. It could be the law clerk who writes the opinion. So here, it was the staff who wrote the report, and one of them, her name is Hrietje Bars, okay, and that's spelled Grietje. First name, last name, Bars, Baars. My Dutch friends tell me it's pronounced Hrietje Bars, more or less. And she is a radical Marxist law professor in London, as radical as they get. And she wrote chapters of the Goldstone report. It was hidden, but somehow on a piece of paper one of the witnesses gave me, it said, for information, contact so-and-so. And I saw her name and I realized that she wrote chapters of the Goldstone report. So that, I'm saying, for 15 years now, you've had commissions of inquiry that have been calling to indict Israeli leaders for war crimes. And we've had many of these commissions of inquiry, but in 2021, after the war of May 2021 between Israel and Hamas, they created a permanent commission of inquiry. So not a one-year commission, but a permanent commission that never ends. It's perpetual. The Goldstone report lasted 6 months. There's some follow-up, maybe another year of follow-up, and that's it. The effects were lasting, but the commission was over. The commission of inquiry that they created in May 2021 and June 2021 it never ends. In that sense, it's the people that they took, the commission that was supposed to look into that war of May 2021, but also into everything that happened in all time. So its scope is everything that's ever happened in the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, and the people they picked for the inquiry, the head of it is Navi Pillay. She was UN Human Rights Chief, who was viscerally anti-Israel. She once said Israel has permanent disdain for international law. She said Israel's apartheid. And she was supposed to judge also whether Israel's committing racism. So the woman who famously said numerous times that Israel is a apartheid state, she's going to investigate objectively whether there's racism being committed by Israel. She also, after the war of May 2021, had said Israel is guilty, and she wrote to President Biden with others saying you need to punish Israel for that war. She's going to investigate objectively what Israel did during that war. Finally, about Navi Pillay, she had been signing appeals saying you need to put an arms embargo against Israel and boycott Israel. It was entitled Sanction Israeli Apartheid, and she's one of the signatories. She's the head of the Objective Commission of Inquiry. That's why we don't call it so much as a commission, rather the Inquisition. She has all the objectivity of our friend Torquemada from the Inquisition. So that's the Commission of Inquiry. They are the ones, by the way, who a couple of years ago asked the General Assembly to initiate an ICJ advisory opinion against Israel, International Court of Justice, which would declare that Israel's presence in the territories in Judea and Samaria, in Jerusalem, are illegal, that Israel's presence in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, on Temple Mount, are all illegal and should be criminalized. And of course the ICJ complied and issued this advisory opinion several months ago. So that's the Commission of Inquiry, perpetual inquisition against Israel. And finally, last but not least, as Machla mentioned, here in Montreal just a few weeks ago, when I was here last about a month ago, we had the visit of the notorious Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine. A word or two about the mandate and her, and then I'll say a few words about UNRWA, and I'll wrap up and take a few questions, if there are. So, Francesca Albanese, her mandate is when she comes to universities, she came to McGill, and she was at Université de Montréal. Shamefully, it was the university itself, the history department, which invited her. It wasn't in McGill, it was the students, but there in Université de Montréal, it was the history department. And she spoke at the same in Georgetown. It was the school that invited her. In Barnard, it was the school. In Princeton, it was the school. It was like the president's special seminar or something that she was invited to in Princeton. Shamefully, she is her mandate. When she goes there, she's called the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian territories. Now, whatever your position is, if there's an expert on human rights in a territory, okay, I don't know, maybe you say there's only about 15 UN mandates to investigate human rights in a territory. There's North Korea, there's Sudan, there's one on Russia. And so there's something on human rights in the Palestinian territories. Maybe it's an over-focus, as I mentioned, the special agenda, but okay. Human rights in the Palestinian territories. If Israel does something wrong, let's talk about it. If the Jihad does something, if Hamas does something, the PA, let's address it. Her mandate is not that. She's introduced as the special rapporteur on human rights in the Palestinian territories, but her mandate, if you open it up, from February 1993, this is before Oslo, has unchanged in 31 years, is the following. You are mandated to investigate Israel's violations of the bases and principles of international law in the territories occupied since 1967. Israel's violations. So if, God forbid, there's a terrorist attack, if terrorists blow up a disco in Tel Aviv, as they did, or a pizza shop in Jerusalem, as they've done, she'll say, it's not my mandate. But if Israel goes to arrest the terrorists, an Israeli action, and it's a violation, presumed, it's not even Israeli actions, Israel's violations. No other mandate, and I said there's about 15 country mandates, has such a thing where it's only focused on the actions of one party, and the actions of that party are presumed in advance to be violations. So that's the mandate. Not surprisingly, those who apply for this mandate are a very shameful bunch. And so it was 2 years ago when the candidates came for this job. We reviewed the candidates. Each one was worse than the next. And we issued a dossier on who they are. And we told the Human Rights Council, Francesca Albanese is someone who, for a decade, has falsely accused Israel of genocide. The genocide thing came up now with the war against Hamas. But someone like Albanese has been saying it for a decade. She's been saying this for a decade. Time and time again, she repeatedly equated Israel with the Nazis. This is something I'm saying before she was appointed, and of course after she was appointed. She said the Nakba is like the Holocaust, meaning the Palestinian plight in the 1948 war. It's like the Holocaust, and so on. So they appointed her. This is exactly what they wanted. And she's also someone who used to work for UNRWA. For 2 years, she was kind of a legal officer for UNRWA. And she wrote a Facebook fundraiser. It was a letter to her parish priest, or the acting bishop, Antonio Blundo. And she writes, "Dear Don Antonio," it's her family priest, and she says, "Dear Don Antonio, raising money for UNRWA, this is in summer of 2014, Israel is killing the Palestinians. And you know the problem is that America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby, and Europe is subjugated by Holocaust guilt." It's a public Facebook post, and by the way, all of her friends who saw it, no one complained. That's the milieu that she runs in, and I'm not aware that her priest, Don Antonio Blundo, criticized her either. America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. Then later, when it came out, more recently that it was called out, she said, I didn't mean to say that. I meant to say something else. I should have said the Israel lobby. Yeah, America is subjugated by the Israel lobby. Not much better either, but when she was at Piers Morgan, she said, "Yeah, I didn't mean to say Jewish lobby." She didn't say the subjugated part. That's so. This is basically an overt anti-Semite. We're not even talking about the contemporary form of anti-Semitism, where the state of Israel, where Jews are demonized as a collective via the state of Israel, but textbook classical medieval anti-Semitism. So that's Francesca Albanese. You may also know that after she was appointed in May 1st, 2022, that a few months later, in repeated interviews, she justified Palestinian violence. They have no choice, she said. They have no choice. What do you want? What are their options? They must be violent. So time and time again in interviews, she justified Palestinian violence. And then infamously, I believe it was November 2022, she went to a conference effectively organized by Hamas. It was organized by a former Hamas minister. All those present were Hamas leaders who spoke at the conference. And she told this Hamas conference, "You have the right to resist." So I'm saying, you, an expert on human rights, telling a Hamas-led conference, you have the right to resist. This is a year before the massacre. 1 year before the massacre. So this is someone who effectively abused her UN mandate to incite, legitimize, and fuel terrorists to commit their actions, saying you have the right to resist. And resistance for Hamas is October 7th. That is resistance. So this is Francesca Albanese. I'll just mention a word about the genocide. This is what we're facing. Amnesty International, despicably just the other day, issued a large report accusing Israel of genocide. The report is a farce. Nowhere do they mention of the people killed in Gaza, how many are combatants, how many are non-combatants. If they would, then they would, of course, their accusations would crumble in a moment. The ratio of combatants to civilians that have been killed is the lowest ratio than any other form of urban warfare in known history. And this is not me saying it, it's John Spencer, who's one of the world's leading experts in urban warfare, that no other army in history has managed to achieve a lower ratio of civilians to combatants. Of course, Hamas attacked Israel deliberately while hiding under homes, hospitals, and schools in hundreds and hundreds of miles of terror tunnels deliberately put under the civilian population. So she's accusing, so Amnesty accuses Israel of genocide. The report opens by saying that on October 7th, Israel attacked Gaza. Right from the start, you see the report. It doesn't say that Hamas broke a ceasefire, invaded and massacred and committed horrific atrocities, but in their skewed narrative, Israel attacked Gaza. So that's Amnesty International. So we have Amnesty International. We have these international court hearings launched by South Africa against Israel, genocide. So this genocide accusation, this modern-day blood libel, which is really, if you think about it, it is to remove the taboo of the Holocaust. I grew up in the 1970s. I remember on TV you would see European leaders once a year would maybe go to Auschwitz, or there'd be memorials about the Holocaust, and they felt guilty for what they had done, either actions by Germany and others that directly involved in massacring Jews, or that were collaborators, which most of the European countries in one form or another collaborated. And there was guilt. The world didn't do anything. If they weren't committing it, the world was divided into two places. Those places where where Jews would be killed, and places where no one would take the Jews. Those were your choices during World War II. And then there was guilt. There was guilt. Rightfully, there was guilt, and anti-Semitism was more than ever, maybe in 2,000 years, was taboo. It wasn't that there wasn't anti-Semitism in the post-war era. There was, but there was a sense that it was something shameful. And if before World War II, you could be openly anti-Semitic in polite company, as our universities would have quotas about how many Jews could come or not come, and you'd have signs here in Montreal and clubs saying no Jews allowed, things like that. After World War II, it was considered shameful. There was a taboo on anti-Semitism, and that's from the Holocaust. And effectively, what we're seeing today is to accuse Israel of them doing a Holocaust, of them doing a genocide. Effectively, the purpose of that is to remove the taboo of anti-Semitism. And that is why we're speaking here with students who are watching here on Zoom and who are here in this room, have had to suffer on the front lines of suffering from this horrific tsunami of open anti-Semitism. Here, Concordia, where I attended for 4 years, to see a graduate of Concordia lifting her hand in a Nazi salute, saying the final solution is coming, is just shocking and horrific. And to see these Intifada people smashing windows and all the terrible things that you've seen, and the shootings in Montreal at the Young Israel and at the Yeshiva Gedola and here and there, it's unbelievable, okay? I never remember one shooting of a Jewish institution my whole life growing up here. I can't remember a single one. And the past year you've had endless. So it's really just horrific. And indeed, the purpose of Francesca Albanese and the ICJ and Amnesty International is to remove, when anti-Semitism was once taboo, I say, you, Israel, and their supporters around the world, the Jews, you are genocidal supporters. That's the word now that is being used, and therefore you're guilty of a Holocaust. And so effectively the point of it is to remove the taboo of anti-Semitism, and they've been successful. Sadly, they've been successful. And I just want to say that there's a Montreal connection to some of this, which is, I was mentioning before to some of the students here, that the accusation that Israelis are Nazis is, Francesca Albanese has been doing this for 10 years, and this past year we see it from so many people. But it's not new. It was tried early on in the 1950s, and I wrote something about this in an essay. There's a book called Jewish Priorities, and I have an essay about what happened to the human rights movement. Because those who drafted many of the UN conventions, I mentioned René Cassin, who was a Jew who drafted the Declaration of Human Rights, and there was Hirsch Lauderpact, who wrote the International Bill of Rights, and our founder Morris Abram, who drafted the UN Convention Against Racism. There were eminent Jewish lawyers who actually wrote some of the founding documents of UN human rights. But during this time, even in the 1950s, there were people who tried to accuse Israel of genocide. But it didn't really stick. But already that idea was emerging. And soon after the founding of Israel, there were some in the West who began to depict the Jewish state in demonic terms. In the 1950s, the renowned historian of the time was Arnold Toynbee. Professor Bauer knows him very well, knows of him, who had described the Jews in his books as a fossilized and extinct society. He had theories about ancient history. He wrote many books about history of the world, and he said the Jews were fossilized and extinct society. And he wrote that Zionism, and I'm quoting, was demonic. Zionism was demonic. This is in the 1950s. He pioneered the idea that the movement for a Jewish homeland was a form of Nazism. This is one of the most famous historians. In his monumental A Study of History, Toynbee accused the Zionists of being, quote, disciples of the Nazis, who chose to imitate, now I'm quoting, who chose to imitate some of the evil deeds that the Nazis had committed against the Jews. Now, you all know in the 1960s, there was a movie called Exodus. The hero was played by Paul Newman. Jews were popular. Jews were cool. And it was after the Holocaust. There was sympathy for the Jews. Israel was new. There were kibbutzim, which were socialist and pioneering. And Israel was still something that was popular. But So it didn't stick, right? Arnold Toynbee is saying in the 1950s, Israelis are demonic, Zionists are demonic, they're disciples of the Nazis, and so it's trying already since then to accuse Jews of genocide and of being evil, but it didn't stick. The time wasn't right for it. But just to mention that in January 1961, Toynbee visited Montreal, and in his lectures, he repeated these accusations that the Jews are a fossilized society and that the Israelis are like Nazis in January 1961. And there was a great man in Canada. He was the Israeli ambassador in Ottawa. His name was Yaakov Herzog. And for those who don't know him, you should know about him. So his brother became the president. His father was Chief Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog, the first Chief Rabbi of Israel. His brother was Chaim Herzog, who eventually became president. And his nephew was the current president, Yitzhak Bushi Herzog. But Yaakov Herzog was a great scholar. He actually apparently was a candidate to be Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom, but chose to remain in a diplomatic position. And at the time, he was an ambassador. I can't think today. So when he read the newspaper in the Montreal Star about what Toynbee had said, he challenged Toynbee to a debate. So Toynbee is the great historian of the time, and an ambassador is challenging him to a debate. I can't think today of any ambassador who would challenge a great historian of the time to a debate. But Herzog was a Talmid Chacham. He was someone very knowledgeable in Judaism and also in law and in politics, and he was a brilliant person. So he challenged Toynbee to debate, and the debate was held at the Hillel House on Stanley. So I'm speaking here to students and activists who know that building very well. So in that building, the most famous event that ever happened there was in January 1961. A debate was held. There was a historic debate between Arnold Toynbee and Ambassador Yaakov Herzog. And the issues at stake were, do the Jewish people exist? He said they stopped existing 2,000 years ago. Well, you see something, but it's a fossil. And Yaakov Herzog, you can listen to the debate on YouTube. He talked about how the Jewish people were not a fossil and how they continued to write the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Piyutim and Maimonides and many other great works of philosophy and so forth. And he said that the Israelis did not act like the Nazis. If you want to say that Israelis during war committed violations, maybe they were like the French, maybe they were like the British, but they weren't like the Nazis. And it's interesting, but one of the organizers of that debate was a young 20-year-old student who was vice president of the Hillel Association, and his name was Erwin Kohler, who everyone here knows is, of course, one of the great human rights lawyers of our time, was Canada's Minister of Justice and Attorney General. And sadly, it was revealed that there was a plot to assassinate him because he's one of the most outspoken defenders of Iranian dissidents who are fighting the oppressive mullah's regime. So Erwin Kotler was a 20-year-old student, and he recounts in the biography of Yaakov Herzog, he recounts apparently that some members of the community, of the old guard, said, "Oh, no, don't hold this event. Don't make trouble." They wanted him to cancel the event. But the event was held, and it was a historic debate, and I invite all of you can read it, and you can listen to it, actually. And there was a record made. In the old days, they used to make vinyl records. My uncle had the vinyl record. My uncle is from Ireland, so Yaakov Herzog grew up in Dublin, so my uncle knew him. My uncle lived in Dublin, so I used to listen to the record. But you can hear it on the internet. I highly recommend you listening to it. But I'm mentioning this because just to remind you that there were efforts even in the 50s, but it didn't stick. Only after the 67 war, suddenly de Gaulle gave the infamous press conference in November 1967, and Professor Brown will correct me if I get it wrong, but he said that the Jews were a peuple d'élite, sûr de lui-même et dominateur.
Exactement.
Yeah. So the Jewish people, he said, he gave this sort of endless press conference where he said the Jewish people were an elite people, domineering, and sure of themselves. Yeah. So it was considered anti-Semitic. His good friend was Raymond Aron, who broke with him. Yeah. Who broke with him over that and wrote a book about it. Yeah. Wrote a book about it. So already that, in my opinion, that's one of those moments where the narrative changed. Suddenly you said, "Oh, Israel is domineering, right? Israel defended itself, domineering," and since then Israel, all the terms that the Nazis were occupiers. Suddenly, only one place in the world is occupiers, right? No one speaks about Turkish-occupied Cyprus or Moroccan-occupied Western Sahara. You could go along many places. Only the Judea and Samaria, the ancient Jewish heartland, that's Israeli-occupied territories. As if an Israeli in Judea is like the French in New Caledonia, which is thousands of miles away, in the Far East. And if it's the same, but even then, no one calls the French occupiers for being in some Polynesian island. But the Israelis in Judea, where I was just in Jerusalem last week, and I was taking a tour next to Emek Rephaim. There's the Begin Museum, and right outside the Begin Museum, there's a architectural find. It was found several years ago. There were graves, and in the graves, it was found several years ago a silver amulet rolled up. And in the amulet, apparently, I think it's from the 6th century, if I'm not getting it wrong, 6th century BCE, the priestly blessing. The priestly blessing, which comes from the Torah. So you have, which is several hundred years before the Dead Sea Scrolls. So in Jerusalem, next to a very popular street in modern day Israel, in the German colony, in Emek Rephaim, is is evidence of the Jewish people ancient existence in the land of Israel. So this is what we're dealing with. Let me say a few more words about talking about Francesca Albanese. I'll come back to that, just to say that she, as I told you, she said, Hamas, you have the right to resist, and many other things. So our work has been to expose her anti-Semitism. We helped get 4 countries to condemn her for anti-Semitism, which has never happened before. The French government, which never condemns a UN rapporteur, they condemned her for anti-Semitism. That's in part because she had the audacity to criticize Macron in a tweet. The French government did not like that, and they rightly accused her of anti-Semitism. She denied that the massacre of October 7th was the worst anti-Semitic act since the Holocaust in a public tweet challenging the Macron. So she was accused of anti-Semitism. Germany condemned her for anti-Semitism. The Canadian Special Envoy on Anti-Semitism condemned her for Holocaust distortion. The Canadian government, the mission in Geneva, criticized her, and America, several ambassadors and government representatives have condemned her for anti-Semitism. So no UN rapporteur has been condemned in that way. And yet, despicably, Amnesty International just a few days ago hosted her for a lecture. So that says something what has happened to the once great Amnesty International, which once was dedicated to freeing political prisoners and now has become an enabler of Hamas terrorism. So we'll leave it at that for Francesca Albanese. I'll just say a word or two about UNRWA, and then I'll wrap up. So a word or two about UNRWA. UNRWA is the UN agency that is to give services to Palestinians. They give them food, they give them medical care, and they give them social services. UNRWA was created initially with good intentions. There was a war in 1948. There were Arab refugees, and they went to Lebanon, to Gaza, to Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, to Jordan. And the UNRWA was going to help them move on. And America was involved in trying to help them resettle. Very quickly, they realized, the Americans, that the Palestinian Arabs didn't want to move on. They had declared a jihad against the Jewish state. And if they would agree to move on, to resettle and start a new life in Lebanon or in Gaza, they would be effectively giving up their war against the Jewish state, and they didn't want to give up that war. So they said, no, we're not resettling. We're going back. The war's not over. The war's not over. So we're going to live in refugee camps. We're not going to actually settle here. And very quickly, UNRWA became the opposite of what it was meant to be. Rather than to resettle, for 80 years now, we've been giving, our countries, our taxpayers, have been giving billions of dollars to UNRWA. They haven't resettled a single Palestinian. Unlike the UNHCR, next to my office in Geneva, the UN Refugee Agency, which resettles refugees. You're a refugee, there was a war, there have been millions like that. They find you a place in Sweden, Canada, whatever, and you move on. My family came here 120 years ago, 1904, escaping Russian persecution, came to Canada, and we became Canadians. And I'm not a Russian refugee 120 years later. But Palestinians are the only people in the world who 75 plus years later, they are refugees. Even those in Jordan who have citizenship. 2 million of them have Jordanian citizenship. They are this oxymoronic thing called a citizen and a refugee. The only point of them being a so-called refugee, which is absurd by any legal definition, is to basically keep the war on Israel alive, to nurture grievance, resentment, and to keep the war on Israel alive. If Arabs living in Jordan are told that they have the right to dismantle Israel, that is going to be their dream. And October 7th is the realization of that. All of the terrorists were brought up in UNRWA schools, told that they're going to have the right of return, and for them, this is how they exercise it. Make no mistake, it's not taking a plane and the right of return. It's to attack Israel and dismantle Israel. So that has become, wasn't meant to be, but that's become the purpose of UNRWA, is to dismantle Israel and to keep the war going. None less than the Swiss foreign minister, Ignacio Cassis, stated in 2018 in a visit after visiting UNRWA facilities in Jordan. He said, "We are perpetuating the conflict." He said, "UNRWA is not the solution. UNRWA is the problem." He said, "It's a perverse logic." This is the Swiss foreign minister. "It's a perverse logic. We're just perpetuating the conflict." And he was attacked by all of Switzerland, and he had to basically keep quiet since then. So since then, he doesn't criticize UNRWA anymore. But he was asked recently in a debate, he's still the Swiss foreign minister, he was asked, wait a minute, do you still stand by what you said 6 years ago? He said, "Yeah, I do, but now I'm here representing the government, and the government's position is that we love UNRWA and you should fund UNRWA." Thankfully, I'll say in a moment about the Swiss parliament. Didn't exactly agree with it. But just the other day, UNRWA said that those criticizing UNRWA are engaged in disinformation. There was a tweet and a statement. They said it's hate speech. They say this is creating immense reputational damage for UNRWA, those who expose their complicity with terrorism. They called for global regulations. So UNRWA is calling for global regulations. They should speak to Elon Musk, and I'm sure he'll agree with that. And they say those responsible for disinformation must be held accountable, and we want regulations must be put in place to control the spread of such damaging and possibly dangerous messages. This is if you say that UNRWA is complicit with terrorism. And we have the receipts. You go on our website, we have a page called The Case Against UNRWA, and you have hundreds and hundreds of pages of UNRWA teachers regularly inciting to terrorism, celebrating terrorist attacks, glorifying Adolf Hitler, pictures of Hitler on their pages saying, "Great guy." And we've been sending this to them for 10 years, and they couldn't care less. They defame us. They defame my organization, UN Watch. They say we're against refugees. All we're saying is that we were saying for 10 years, we're giving money for UNRWA. Maybe you shouldn't have teachers who are Nazis, who celebrate Hamas terrorism. Is that so wrong? And it was for them. And then this year it was revealed that actually at least a dozen UNRWA staff, at least known a dozen, participated in the October 7th massacre. Famously, the U.S. government said, we're going to freeze funding. They asked their allies to do the same. And for a moment, $450 million was frozen. About 15 plus countries froze their funding, including Canada. But it was very brief. Even as they froze the funding, they looked for ways to climb down. The governments, for whatever reason, they love UNRWA. They say it's irreplaceable, indispensable, humanitarian, lifeline, life-saving, lifeline, life-saving. That is the mantra that they all repeat. And they created a fake inquiry. This was headed by Catherine Colonna, the former foreign minister of France. She was supposed to conduct an independent review, and 2 months later, the independent review said that UNRWA is a life-saving, lifeline, humanitarian backbone, indispensable, irreplaceable. So the mantra that we heard for a decade, that was her conclusion of the independent review. The review was a complete sham. It was a farce. Catherine Colonna was not independent. She, a month earlier, had said that we love UNRWA. It was never as needed as much as it is now. She sat on the advisory commission of UNRWA, gave $60 million for France to UNRWA. If she'd be investigating UNRWA's complicity with terrorism, she'd be implicating herself as one of the overseers and donors of UNRWA. So putting her in charge of it was a farce. They had 3 Scandinavian institutes that were doing the work with her. 3 Scandinavian institutes. What could be more objective than a Scandinavian institute? And yet, despite having beautiful names like the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, Raoul Wallenberg, of course, the great Hungarian diplomat, Swedish diplomat rather, who in Hungary saved thousands and thousands of Jews, but using his name, this is a completely anti-Israel institute. They took 3 anti-Israel institutes, which are lobbyists for UNRWA. One of the groups called CMI, their lead researcher on UNRWA, her name is Kirsty Berg. Kirsty Berg is a lobbyist for UNRWA, and she's the researcher who's going to help Catherine Colonna decide if UNRWA is complicit or not with terrorism. The whole thing was fake, phony fraud, and they even said it themselves. Chris Gunnis, the longtime spokesman for UNRWA, said the whole point of this review is to allow countries, the donors, to climb down and save face so they can reinstate the funding. He said it. And Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, said that at the beginning of the review, he said those who accuse UNRWA of being complicit with terrorists are engaged in a smear campaign. So it was never an objective analysis of whether there's evidence, which there is, of UNRWA being complicit with terrorists. It was, the whole review was a sham. And based on that review, Germany reinstated funding, Japan reinstated funding. Our Trudeau government didn't even wait for the fake review. They reinstated funding before the fake review even came out. So quite despicable. Despite all of that, what's the truth? The truth about UNRWA is, I'm just going to mention a handful of things, and then I'll wrap up. The truth is that earlier this year, I think it was February, underneath UNRWA headquarters in Gaza, they found a terror tunnel with a computer server in it, massive computer server with electric cable going directly up into the UNRWA headquarters, right? So terror tunnel underneath their headquarters, and the UNRWA chief wrote on Twitter, UNRWA did not know what is under its headquarters. UNRWA did not know. Now, I don't know if you've ever been next to a tunnel being dug. I was in Geneva when they dug a train tunnel, and for a couple of years I couldn't sleep. That was the building project in Gaza. Unlike Dubai, where they build up for the future, in Gaza they built down. They built terror tunnels. That was the business, building hundreds and hundreds of miles of terror tunnels. And but UNRWA did not know there was a tunnel beneath their headquarters. Except when he said this, it was 1 week after the Wall Street Journal had an article, and they reported that 10 years ago, 2014, UNRWA staff saw that the parking lot of their compound was sinking. Everyone, reported the Wall Street Journal, knew why, but no one said anything. They didn't say anything because UNRWA is a mafia, fascist, terrorist regime, and if you say anything, you're dead. So everyone knew, but Lazzarini says, we didn't know. We didn't know. It's always the line, we didn't know, we didn't know. So that's the computer server. Who are the leaders of UNRWA? You see Philippe Lazzarini is a very effective spokesman in French and in English, and he's very calm. He's the face of UNRWA. He's the face of UNRWA. He's the fundraiser of UNRWA. But he's not the leader of UNRWA. 99% of UNRWA are Palestinians. It's a Palestinian organization with a facade of a handful of international faces. 99% are Palestinians. And who are they? Well, let's look at their leaders. The leader of the teachers union of UNRWA in Lebanon. He sadly died a few months ago when an Israeli missile took him out. Delivered justice to him. Fatri al-Sharif, who was the head of the teachers union, principal of a major school outside of Tyre, Lebanon. He was, for 10 years, our organization saw, we went on Facebook and we saw that for 10 years, every day he was posting pictures of Hamas leaders celebrating Hamas. Again, UNRWA did not know. They did not know, except that he had thousands of friends on Facebook, and half of them are UNRWA peers. So UNRWA didn't know, except they were clicking like on his posts celebrating Hamas. When Israel delivered justice to him in the middle of the night on his second floor apartment, right to his apartment, and he was eliminated, Hamas put out a statement saying, "You killed our leader." I mean, he wasn't just a teacher who celebrated Hamas. We knew he was something with Hamas, but Hamas said he was our leader in Lebanon. And we praise him for his jihadi education. They put out a video eulogizing him, pictures of him with Ismail Haniyeh visiting Lebanon, and together, and him with armed guards. The guy was the head of the mafia of Hamas in Lebanon, and he was the head of the teachers union. Head of the teachers union, not just principal of a school, chairman of the UNRWA teachers union. And when UNRWA heard something about him, a government complained, I think it was Israel, they gave him a slap on the wrist. They suspended him, but the terrorist group said you're not allowed to fire him, and UNRWA refused to fire him. So that's the head of the teachers union, Fatri al-Sharif. Again, UNRWA said, we didn't know. We didn't know, except for 10 years, every day he told you. So we call it hiding in plain sight. He was hiding in plain sight. We didn't know. By the way, the head of the teachers union, and you could say it's a one-off. It happened. We didn't know. The head of the teachers union in Gaza, his name is Suhail al-Hindi. He is an elected member of the Hamas Politburo. When this was first brought to the attention of UNRWA in 2017, Chris Gunnis, the spokesman, said, but we asked him, and he said, it's not true. That was his response. Chris Gunnis said, we asked Mr. Al-Hindi, are you on the Hamas Politburo? He said, no, it's never happened. Lo hayal v'lo nivra. Except it was published that he was on the Hamas Politburo. Eventually, he had to leave UNRWA, and he's an open member of the Hamas Politburo. There's pictures of him with Yahya Sinwar, and he's interviewed every day. He went to Turkey. He has major rallies with Turkish Hezbollah. He's now one of the open leaders of Hamas. He was quoted the other day about what they're going to do with the hostages. He was the head of the teachers union, also principal of a school. And when UNRWA wanted to suspend him years ago, they had all 8,000 teachers of UNRWA, all 8,000 teachers rallied on his behalf. So UNRWA will tell you it's only 9, it's only 12, it's only, so yeah, it's only, I did a tweet the other day, you can read it. It's only, I had a list of like 15 different things. It's only 2,000 teachers who rallied for Fathi al-Sharif, the Hamas leader in Lebanon. It's only 8,000 who rallied for Suhail al-Hindi, Hamas terror chief in Gaza. It's only 3,000 UNRWA teachers who celebrated the massacre as it was happening on Telegram. It's only 13,000 UNRWA staff in Gaza who didn't lift a finger to help the hostages, right? 13,000 staff in Gaza. Hundreds of them know where some of the hostages are if they're not holding them themselves, because some UNRWA staff did hold the hostages, as we learned. But not one of them lifted a finger, so-called humanitarian aid workers. That's the truth about UNRWA. And finally, we just revealed photos of UNRWA chiefs regularly meeting with the terrorists, including former UNRWA chief Pierre Krachenbuhl, a Swiss guy who's now the head of the Red Cross, the head of the ICRC. And he met the terrorists, Hamas and the Jihad, and he told them, he said, this is in a transcript published on the internet, and he said, if you ever have a problem with UNRWA, just come to us, don't complain, come to us. We want to hear you. Even if you come, we disagree, you can come to us 1,000 times, and if there's a decision you don't like, we'll tear it up. We'll tear up the decision. Basically giving the terrorists the veto power. And then he said at the end, he said, if we, first of all, don't talk about our meeting, because could embarrass the donors. Don't talk about that we met. And then he says at the end, if we keep this communication, if we stay united, no one can separate us. So this is the head of UNRWA to the terrorists. So that is the truth about UNRWA. And I'm thankful that the United States, I appeared 4 times in Congress last year to talk about this. In March, they voted bipartisan legislation, pressure by the Republicans. Biden signed it into law. 0 money. America was giving $300 million every year, 0 for UNRWA until March 2025. I'm hopeful that the new administration and the new Congress will continue that freeze. And finally, the Swiss Parliament, the National Council, which is the lower house, voted. I appeared there in April. They invited UNRWA, then they invited me. I was the only. UN Watch was the only critical voice invited. The Swiss media, the French Swiss media, went crazy. They were like, UN Watch, they're evil. You can't invite them. They're evil. They're an Israeli NGO. We're actually founded in Geneva in 1993, and the Swiss media, which is a tiny little village, they know that we're based in Geneva, but they were telling lies about us. But I appeared and I testified, and that was in April. And in September 14th, if I'm not mistaken, the Swiss National Council voted 99 to 88, and I quote, to immediately suspend funding for UNRWA. Immediately suspend funding for UNRWA. In that motion, they cite explicitly the reports by UN Watch about UNRWA complicity with terrorism. As they say today, as the kids say on Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is, when UN Watch makes these accusations and allegations, we have the proof, we have the receipts, we have the screenshots, we have the timeline, everything. And UNRWA is saying disinformation. Tell us. On our website are hundreds and hundreds of pages of the screenshots of everything I told you about. Proof, receipts, screenshots, timeline, everything. So the Swiss Parliament cited us, which was amazing. The motion will go to the Upper House. The Upper House voted a week or 2 ago to hold hearings themselves, and they said they want to invite UN Watch. That may be in January. So a lot of work up ahead. Sadly, this is a battle that is very much uphill. But there are some world leaders who are going to fight them. We know that the incoming U.S. administration, both the Congress and the White House, are going to fight these terrorists and their enablers. And the message of that, as Mahla said, is that our job is to light the candle of truth and to never give up. Thank you very much. Now, it's late. I spoke for a long time. I'm sorry. And Shabbat is coming in soon. Maybe we'll just do a few minutes of questions, and then and whoever needs to leave, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I have many questions, but I'll concentrate on what I think is very important now. This Amnesty report international is making waves, and I would like simply, regarding our own Jewish community and our schools, they have to face this accusation, and we have to prepare them or to give them a document that simply explains the whole situation and the whole bias of not only UN, but especially Amnesty International. Can you help on that?
Yeah, look, there are many organizations that have been active in the fake genocide report. A number of people have responded to this. There are many materials available online. We ourselves are planning a very substantial report to expose the blood libel of the genocide report that will hopefully come out in the next couple of months. So we're working on that, but there are many materials that you can find online, and our work recently has been on the things that I described. But we will be addressing that.
I mean, so much of this information, as you pointed out, is readily available for a lot of these countries to actually see, and they're choosing not to see it.
Yes.
So let me ask you just some questions about that. First of all, we know that neo-Marxism is behind a lot of this, anti-Semitism is behind a lot of this, but for those countries like Canada and many of the European countries, what does gas and oil have to do with all of this? Is that not the underlying factor? That's number one question. And in terms of anti-Semitism, are you finding that those countries that are Catholic-oriented, meaning that they come from a Catholic background, they consider themselves Catholic, are more anti-Semitic and more vehement going against Israel than some of the other countries? Because if you look at Ireland, Spain, and Norway, for instance, who recognize the Palestinian state, they're all Catholics. Now, I know a lot of people are no longer religious, I understand that, but it's still an integrated belief system that they're probably living with.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, about the gas and oil, it's a very good question. Historically, first of all, the donors for UNRWA are Western states. And that's deliberate. The UNRWA and its supporters, it's not so much the money, because Qatar, their budget is about 1.2 billion a year. Qatar could write the check in 2 seconds. It's nothing for them. But they want the legitimacy, and it's Western countries. Deliberately they want, it was written, I've seen it, we don't want to Arabize UNRWA, we want Western donors. That's why the donors are the U.S. up until March. The U.S. already gave this year more than 100 million, went out the door. State Department very strongly supports UNRWA, even that the law of Congress defunds, but the State Department still says we love UNRWA. The United States, France, Germany, all the Western countries are supporting UNRWA, and that's deliberate. It's the legitimacy, right? It's not the money; it's the legitimacy that they say the world is with us. The world is supporting our battle against the Jews and the Jewish state. So why do the Western countries do this? I don't know. Why is Canada? All the reports. I sent a 200-page report to the Trudeau in 2017. They didn't even bother to answer us. So they have zero interest. By the way, not one of the foreign ministries, which are responsible for overseeing the relationship with UNRWA, not one of them ever contacted us and said, we oversee the grant to UNRWA. We visit UNRWA facilities. You're making these accusations. Can we talk? Not interested at all. Not interested. They all are eager to funnel the money out the door. Now, you might say that the charitable argument is that they're doing it for stability. It was thought, even in Israel, it was thought that UNRWA, if not for UNRWA, there'd be chaos. They run the schools and take out the garbage in Gaza and other places. So it gives stability. You could say some countries care about stability, but you would think they would care a little bit about the complicity with terrorism, the anti-Semitism, but they haven't. Why don't they care? It could be, indeed, that starting in the 50s and 60s, that the Arab countries said, if you, the West, don't support UNRWA, the Arab countries said, you created Israel, it's your fault. Okay, this was their narrative. You, the West, created Israel, it's an imperialist creation, and therefore you have to pay for UNRWA. We want you to pay for UNRWA to embrace this subversive organization, which is keeping the grievance and keeping the war alive. You have to pay for it. And you could say that Western countries were afraid that if they wouldn't kick in the money for UNRWA, they wouldn't get the oil. So that could be a factor. Doesn't explain, the U.S., as far as I understand, is basically independent in terms of oil. I don't think the U.S. is funding it because of oil. Norway has its own resources when it comes to oil and gas. So Norway is very eager. For many of them, it's ideology. The Norwegians especially. The Norwegians are very big in UNRWA. The current director of the Norwegian Foreign Ministry, Lenny Stenseth, was the number 2 of UNRWA. She went to Gaza to meet with Yahya Sinwar and kowtowed before him in June 2021, when an UNRWA official in Gaza named Matthias Schmel made the mistake of saying that actually the IDF strikes during the war of May 2021 were very precise. He acknowledged that on Israeli TV, and that said he was persona non grata, even though he's terribly anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian. But on TV, he said that Israeli strikes against the terrorists were precise. Hamas kicked him out, had to leave Gaza, and then Lenny Stenseth, who's now the Norwegian head of the foreign ministry, she went to Yahya Sinwar and apologized and all that. So, and I went to Norway, and I met with previously another senior diplomat, and he was completely standing with UNRWA 100%. He said, it's just a few bad apples. It's just, he was ready for me. He said, oh no, but it's just 30,000 workers and it's 5 people, right? I already gave you the numbers of the 2,000 and the 8,000 and the 3,000 and the 13,000, but that their line is still, it's just a few bad apples. So those organizations, frankly, some of them are anti-Israel ideology. So I'm sure there's other factors at play, but for some of them it's anti-Israel ideology, and the scary part that we don't really want to talk about is that it could be that our governments are supporting UNRWA because they understand that the whole purpose is to say that Israel's creation is a crime, that UNRWA is the witness to the crime of 1948, and to dismantle Israel. I mean, that's, you have to ask why our governments are supporting them, and I'm not sure if it's because of gas and oil or for other reasons. Your second question about the anti-Israel countries and the correlation between those who are Catholics, a fascinating question. Certainly we know that the Catholic Church had a very hard time with the creation of Israel. I mentioned the Yaakov Herzog. This is something, he was actually in charge of Israel's relations with the Catholic Church for a while. He had gone with his father, the chief rabbi, after the war, to the Pope, I believe, and other places to try to find the missing children who were rescued by Gentiles, and also in convents, and try to find them and retrieve them after the Holocaust. So he had a special, that was his job, was relations with the Catholic Church. And I think he writes about in his book, which I highly recommend reading his book, which is called A Nation That Dwells Alone, a collection of his writings. He writes about how the Catholic Church had a very hard time. A Nation That Dwells Alone. Yeah. Yeah. He writes about how the Catholic Church had a very hard time ideologically with the creation of Israel. So you may well be right. You mentioned countries like Ireland and Spain, which are horrible. Of course, then you have the Norwegians, which are also terrible, and I don't think they're Catholic. I think they're Lutheran.
Actually, they are.
No, I thought they're Lutheran,
they
no?
Are, no, they have a huge Catholic contingent.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
Yeah. That's why the thought occurred to
okay.
me that all 3 were.
Yeah, it's beyond my expertise, but you raise a good issue. I can take a couple other questions, and we'll have to leave it there.
So really quickly, if you were to bring an engineer to go look at a building for repair, the first decision is, do we tear it down and start over, or can this thing be repaired? I'd like your opinion as to the United Nations on that basis. And secondly, could you say a few words about what a gongo is and what they do at the United Nations?
A gongo. Okay. So can the UN be repaired? It could be repaired, but it would require a lot of work. It would require, for a start, the decent countries. I'm not expecting very much from North Korea and Iran and Syria, but I'm expecting from the decent countries to do the right thing. And too many of them go along to get along. Very few of them. When the Islamic regime of Iran was elected chair of the UN Human Rights Council Social Forum, no one complained. No one complained. We, UN Watch, were the first to complain. Then the Americans said something, and that was it. A group of members of the European Parliament, individual parliamentarians, complained. That was it. No European country, no democracy said a thing. When China gets elected, they don't say a thing. So too often, our own democracies just go along to get along and don't do the right thing. Were they to act differently, they could repair the UN, but they choose not to for their own interests. Now, if you got rid of the UN, would you solve the problem? I don't know. The same players would want to meet and would want to give voice to their views. They could meet as a special meeting of the signatories to the Geneva Conventions, which may be holding a meeting soon, as called for in a UN resolution. They could meet in many other bodies, the Football Federation, the Soccer Federation, the FIFA. They'll meet and try to kick out Israel. And so the same players can meet in other rooms and do terrible things even if you didn't have the UN. They'll create another body which will replicate the same thing. So I'm not defending the UN at all, and I would say in the past year, never before in history has the case against the UN been stronger. So if Donald Trump were to ask me, Mr. Neuer, should we get rid of the UN? Would the world be a better place? And as a real estate titan of Manhattan, I would know what to do with all that real estate, that beautiful real estate on the East River. What do you think we should do? To be honest, it'd be hard to make the case to save the UN. So it's an open question. You asked, what is a GONGO? For those who don't know, that's an acronym, GONGO, which is a government-operated NGO. An NGO is a non-governmental organization, so that's an oxymoron. And my organization is a non-governmental organization, recognized at the UN. At the UN, the dictatorships subvert many of the UN institutions, and one of the things they subvert are the NGOs. In Geneva, NGOs have significant access to the UN and a platform. When the Human Rights Council meets, first it's the governments, but then the NGOs. We speak, and it's if you've ever seen speeches of myself, but also of the son of Hamas who spoke, or we bring the leader of opposition from Venezuela and Belarus and Russia and Syria and Iran, we've brought them to speak at the UN. That's an amazing thing that NGOs can do, is to confront the oppressive regimes in their face, which you can't do anywhere else in the world. So I can bring someone who was thrown into prison, and they can confront their government at the Human Rights Council because we're an NGO. So and NGOs are considered to be, to have a halo. They're human rights groups. They're NGOs. And so what the regimes did is they created fake NGOs. So the Syrians created fake NGOs. It would be the Arab Lawyers Human Rights League. I'm just making up the name, but there are many groups that have wonderful sounding names, and they're invited to speak at the UN, and they get their 2 minutes. And you might have a 20 minutes debate where half the NGO speaking are fake. China, if there's an NGO based in China, it's fake. You can't be an independent organization in China. I told you do this, you're in prison. Imagine you create an independent NGO to, not just to do this, but to write things and say things. You're in prison right away. Any group says, oh, hi, we're an NGO based in China, here's our address. I told my staff, go look at the list of NGOs. There's 4,000 of them, maybe more. And anyone that has an address in China is fake. Automatically, it's fake. You can't have an address in China and be an independent NGO. You are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And indeed, we brought a young woman who used to live in Montreal, Tiana Wang. Her father is Wang Binzhang, the father of the Chinese democracy movement. His daughter, Tiana Wang, who's named after the Tiananmen Square massacre. She grew up in Montreal, attended McGill Law School in 2014. Brought her to testify at the Human Rights Council, and behind her there was a guy with an iPad, a very stern-looking Chinese gentleman, an NGO, had an NGO badge, and he was taking pictures of her computer. He was standing taking pictures of her computer. I remember he was sitting down before this happened, and I said, oh, can I ask you to move because we need to use that seat to speak? And he was like, and he was wearing like a leather jacket, and he had pockmarks on his face. He didn't look like the usual NGO type. They have a certain look, and it's usually people in a bookstore from San Francisco with ponytails, and he didn't have that look. He was like, and then you could see the video. There was him and with 6 others. They were NGO badges. They were Chinese regime spies. They were spying on a young, tiny woman, dissident. Her father's been in prison for decades. And the New York Times went to visit the address of that NGO in Beijing. New York Times correspondent Didi Tatlow went to visit the address of this NGO, and it was the Chinese Pentagon. Okay? The Chinese military headquarters in Beijing. And the guy came with sunglasses, like, she says, is this the Tibetan Development Society for Tibetan Development? I said, yes. And the whole thing was fake, and the UN, they made the guy, security actually was good, they made the guy delete his pictures of her computer. But rather than kick that NGO out, obviously it's a Chinese front organization, they just suspended him for like 3 days. That was it. And so any Chinese group is fake, any group in Syria is fake, any group in Cuba is fake, and Cubans have many fake NGOs. Cubans are very active at the UN. So it's a whole topic, and you can go on our website, unwatch.org, and we've named some of the GONGOs. But you can find out by just see their address. If anyone who didn't ask a question yet, we'll have to leave it at, yeah, sir, if anyone didn't ask a question yet, yeah.
How is it that, we speak extensively about the lack of accountability mechanisms that meaningfully and responsibly hold those who violate and abuse their power to account. How is it that these mechanisms are so weak and have been eroded completely so that individuals such as Albanese can accuse Israel and the United States of implicitly being behind the current situation in Syria, and accusing Israel and the United States of partaking in a form of colonialism. I mean, on Twitter, she's quite adamant on that accusation, especially in regards to the situation in Syria now. How is it that the United Nations especially lacks any credible and considerable mechanisms to hold those who are clearly partisan to account?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. And look, there's two issues here. One is there a mechanism to hold a UN rapporteur, which means basically an investigator? Is there a mechanism to hold the UN investigators to account? And secondly, how would it work? So there is a lacuna, there's a vacuum, you would say, in this area at the UN, where they never developed a mechanism to hold the rapporteurs to account. There's about 70 of them, but about maybe more than 50 different mandates. Some mandates have 5-person mandates, a working group. So there's about approximately 80 of these individuals who are called UN independent experts. They're called special procedures. And basically, there's no accountability at all. And in theory, if they're accountable to anyone, it's the member states. There's no procedure to fire them. And it's, for an entity that always speaks about accountability, certainly we're talking about Israel, Israel must be held accountable, and accountability and war crime accountability, minimum accountability for a UN expert who embraces terrorists or who accepts a trip to Australia that worth $20,000, where one of the pro-Hamas groups that brought her said they sponsored it, which is against UN rules. There's zero accountability. And that's it's an example of how the Human Rights Council is a failure. But even if there were accountability, let's say that in theory it's the member states should do something, and I go to the ambassador and I go, you have to hold her accountable, do something, say something. They're not interested. They generally, it doesn't look nice. It's not considered proper to criticize a UN rapporteur. The major NGOs, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, they work very closely with the rapporteurs. They feed them information. The rapporteurs often do copy-paste. So that whole system of UN rapporteurs, who are unpaid, by the way, they're unpaid, relies very much on NGOs. So Amnesty and Human Rights Watch sort of feed material to the UN rapporteurs. They copy-paste them, and it becomes a UN report. So in Canada, when they invite a UN rapporteur, it's usually a radical left group in Canada will tell a rapporteur who's radical left, come visit Canada as an official visit. They'll bring them for a few days. The entire agenda will be radical left causes. And then there'll be a UN report embracing whatever their issue is, condemning Canada for being a colonial regime or being capitalist or whatever it is. So the NGOs very much work with the rapporteurs. And if a government criticizes the rapporteurs, the NGOs would get angry at them. So you would be portrayed as being against human rights, how dare, if you're the Netherlands, France, Germany, UK, you're criticizing a UN rapporteur. Moses spoke to, the Lord spoke to Moses at Sinai. They're Plato, Aristotle, they're amazing, wonderful, virtuous people. How can you condemn a rapporteur? So the fact that 4 governments condemned Albanese is extraordinary because they never condemn UN rapporteurs. So you're absolutely right. It's a mark of shame that the system has no accountability. But again, even if there were a process, the problem is that who guards the guardians? We're speaking about Plato, right? That was his question, who guards the guardians? And in the end, the Human Rights Council is monitoring them.
Yeah, 3 points. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was a very interesting one. Basically, what you're doing is to shame our enemies by showing they're lying. Okay, but my question is, don't you believe something else should be done, which is to tell people who are our enemies, if you're logical with yourself, the only way to settle the problem is to have a new genocide of the Jewish people, to put them on the defense, not because they're lying, this we know, but because logically, if Israel is always wrong, the only way for the whole world to be free and happy and everything is to get rid of Israel. And as Jews won't commit suicide, you have to kill them. So to put the focus on not that they are lying to us, to the whole world, but their logic is automatically linked to the goal of destroying the Jewish people, of being themselves guilty of genocide.
That's true.
Yeah,
That is true.
you make a powerful point, and certainly they're enabling the enemies of Israel. When you hear a speech of Amnesty International at the Human Rights Council, and then you hear the speech of the Islamic regime of Iran, you couldn't tell the difference. If I gave you the text of each one, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So they are enabling the terrorists and those who seek to destroy Israel. So I would have to agree. We can speak privately afterwards. I don't have much more time.
It's about, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what I was